Section 1 of the History of England from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15, by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Section 1. While the Convocation was wrangling on the one side of Old Palace Yard, the Parliament was wrangling even more fiercely on the other. The Houses, which had separated on the 20th of August, had met again on the 19th of October. On the day of meeting an important change struck every eye. Halifax was no longer on the woolsack. He had reason to expect that the persecution, from which the preceding session he had narrowly escaped, would be renewed. The events which had taken place during the recess, and especially the disasters of the campaign in Ireland, had furnished his persecutors with fresh means of annoyance. His administration had not been successful, and though his failure was partly to be ascribed to causes against which no human wisdom could have contended, it was also partly to be ascribed to the peculiarities of his temper and of his intellect. It was certain that a large party in the Commons would attempt to remove him, and he could no longer depend on the protection of his master. It was natural that a prince who was emphatically a man of action should become weary of a minister who was a man of speculation. Charles, who went to council as he went to the play, solely to be amused, was delighted with an adviser who had 100 pleasant and ingenious things to say on both sides of every question. But William had no taste for disquisitions and disputations, however lively and subtle, which occupied much time and led to no conclusion. It was reported, and is not improbable, that on one occasion he could not refrain from expressing in sharp terms at the council board his impatience at what seemed to him a morbid habit of indecision. Halifax, mortified by his mischances in public life, dejected by domestic calamities, disturbed by apprehensions of an impeachment, and no longer supported by royal favour, became sick of public life, and began to pine for the silence and solitude of his seat in Nottinghamshire, an old Cistercian abbey buried deep among woods. Early in October it was known that he would no longer preside in the Upper House. It was at the same time whispered as a great secret that he meant to retire altogether from business, and that he retained the Privy Seal only till a successor should be named. Chief Baron Atkins was appointed Speaker of the Lords. On some important points there appeared to be no difference of opinion in the legislature. The Commons unanimously resolved that they would stand by the King in the work of reconquering Ireland, and that they would enable him to prosecute with vigour the war against France. With equal unanimity they voted an extraordinary supply of 2 millions. It was determined that the greater part of this sum should be levied by an assessment on real property. The rest was to be raised partly by a poll tax, and partly by new duties on tea, coffee, and chocolate. It was proposed that £100,000 should be exacted from the Jews, and this proposition was at first favourably received by the House, but difficulties arose. The Jews presented a petition in which they declared that they could not afford to pay such a sum, and that they would rather leave the kingdom than stay there to be ruined. Enlightened politicians could not but perceive that special taxation, laid on a small class which happens to be rich, unpopular and defenceless, is really a confiscation, and must ultimately impoverish rather than enrich the state. After some discussion the Jew tax was abandoned. The Bill of Rights, which in the last session had, after causing much altercation between the Houses, been suffered to drop, was again introduced and was speedily passed. The Peers no longer insisted that any person should be designated by name as a successor to the crown, if Mary, Anne, and William should all die without posterity. During 11 years nothing more was heard of the claims of the House of Brunswick. The Bill of Rights contained some provisions which deserve special mention. The Convention had resolved that it was contrary to the interest of the kingdom to be governed by a Papist, but had prescribed no test which could ascertain whether a prince was or was not a Papist. The defect was now supplied. It was enacted that every English sovereign should, in full Parliament, and at the coronation, repeat and subscribe the Declaration against Transubstantiation. It was also enacted that no person who should marry a Papist should be capable of reigning in England, and that if the sovereign should marry a Papist, the subject should be absolved from allegiance. Burnet boasts that this part of the Bill of Rights was his work. He had little reason to boast, for a more wretched specimen of legislative workmanship will not easily be found. In the first place, no test is prescribed. Whether the consort of a sovereign has taken the oath of supremacy, has signed the declaration against transubstantiation, has communicated according to the ritual of the Church of England, are very simple issues of fact. But whether the consort of a sovereign is or is not a papist is a question about which people may argue for ever. What is a papist? The word is not a word of definite signification either in law or in theology. It is merely a popular nickname, and means very different things in different mouths. Is every person a papist who is willing to concede to the Bishop of Rome a primacy among Christian prelates? If so, James I., Charles I., Laud, Heylin were papists. Or is the appellation to be confined to persons who hold the ultramontane doctrines touching the authority of the Holy See? If so, neither Bossuet nor Pascal was a papist. What again is the legal effect of the words which absolved the subject from his allegiance? Is it meant that a person arraigned for high treason may tender evidence to prove that the sovereign has married a papist? Would Whistlewood, for example, have been entitled to an acquittal if he could have proved that King George I. had married Mrs. Fitzherbert, and that Mrs. Fitzherbert was a papist? It is not easy to believe that any tribunal would have gone into such a question. Yet to what purpose is it to enact that, in a certain case, the subject shall be absolved from his allegiance, if the tribunal before which he is tried for violation of his allegiance is not to go into the question whether that case has arisen? The question of the dispensing power was treated in a very different manner, was fully considered, and was finally settled in the only way in which it could be settled. The Declaration of Right had gone no further than to pronounce that the dispensing power, as of late exercised, was illegal. That a certain dispensing power belonged to the Crown was a proposition sanctioned by authorities and precedents, of which even Whig lawyers could not speak without respect; but as to the precise extent of this power hardly any two jurists were agreed, and every attempt to frame a definition had failed. At length, by the Bill of Rights, the anomalous prerogative which had caused so many fierce disputes was absolutely and for ever taken away. In the House of Commons there was, as might have been expected, a series of sharp debates on the misfortunes of the autumn. The negligence or corruption of the Navy Board, the frauds of the contractors, the rapacity of the captains of the King's ships, the losses of the London merchants, were themes for many keen speeches. There was, indeed, reason for anger. A severe inquiry, conducted by William in person at the Treasury, had elicited the fact that much of the salt with which the meat furnished to the fleet had been cured had been by accident mixed with galls such as are used for the purpose of making ink. The victuallers threw the blame on the rats, and maintained that the provisions thus seasoned, though certainly disagreeable to the palate, were not injurious to health. The Commons were in no temper to listen to such excuses. Several persons who had been concerned in cheating the government and poisoning the sailors were taken into custody by the sergeant, but no censure was passed on the chief offender, Torrington, nor does it appear that a single voice was raised against him. He had personal friends in both parties. He had many popular qualities. Even his vices were not those which excite public hatred. The people readily forgave a courageous open-hand sailor for being too fond of his bottle, his boon companions, and his mistresses, and did not sufficiently consider how great must be the perils of a country of which the safety depends on a man sunk in indolence, stupefied by wine, enervated by licentiousness, ruined by prodigality, and enslaved by sycophants and harlots. The sufferings of the army in Ireland called forth strong expressions of sympathy and indignation. The Commons did justice to the firmness and wisdom with which Schomberg had conducted the most arduous of all campaigns. That he had not achieved more was attributed chiefly to the villainy of the commissariat. The pestilence, itself was said, would have been no serious calamity if it had not been aggravated by the wickedness of man. The disease had generally spared those who had warm garments and bedding, and had swept away by the thousands those who were thinly clad and who slept on the wet ground. Immense sums had been drawn out of the treasury, yet the pay of the troops was in arrear. Hundreds of horses, tens of thousands of shoes, had been paid for by the public, yet the baggage was left behind for want of beasts to draw it, and the soldiers were marching barefoot through the mire. £1700 had been charged to the government for medicines, yet the common drugs with which every apothecary in the smallest market town was provided were not to be found in the plague-stricken camp. The cry against Shales was loud. An address was carried to the throne, requesting that he might be sent for to England, and that his accounts and papers might be secured. With this request the king readily complied, but the Whig majority was not satisfied. By whom had Shales been recommended for so important a place as that of Commissary General? He had been a favourite at Whitehall in the worst times. He had been zealous for the Declaration of Indulgence. Why had this creature of James been entrusted with the business of catering for the army of William? It was proposed by some of those who were bent on driving all Tories and Trimmers from office, to ask his Majesty by whose advice a man so undeserving of the royal confidence had been employed. The most moderate and judicious Whigs pointed out the indecency and impolicy of interrogating the king, and of forcing him either to accuse his ministers or quarrel with the representatives of his people. "Advise his Majesty, if you will," said Somers, "to withdraw his confidence from the councillors who recommended this unfortunate appointment. Such advice, given, as we should probably give it, unanimously, must have great weight with him. But do not put to him a question such as no private gentleman would willingly answer. Do not force him, in defence of his own personal dignity, to protect the very men whom you wish him to discard." After a hard fight of 2 days, and several divisions, the address was carried by 195 votes to 146. The king, as might have been foreseen, coldly refused to turn informer, and the House did not press him further. To another address, which requested that a commission might be sent to examine into the state of things in Ireland, William returned a very gracious answer, and desired the Commons to name the commissioners. The Commons, not to be outdone in courtesy, excused themselves, and left it to his Majesty's wisdom to select the fittest persons. In the midst of the angry debates on the Irish war a pleasing incident produced for a moment good humour and unanimity. Walker had arrived in London, and had been received there with boundless enthusiasm. His face was in every print shop. Newsletters describing his person and his demeanour were sent to every corner of the kingdom. Broadsides of prose and verse, written in his praise, were carried in every street. The companies of London feasted him splendidly in their halls. The common people crowded to gaze on him wherever he moved, and almost stifled him with rough caresses. Both the universities offered him the degree of Doctor of Divinity. Some of his admirers advised him to present himself at the palace in that military garb in which he had repeatedly headed the sallies of his fellow townsmen. But with a better judgment than he sometimes showed, he made his appearance at Hampton Court in the peaceful robe of his profession, was most graciously received, and was presented with an order for £5000. "And do not think, Doctor," William said with great benignity, "that I offer you this sum as payment for your services. I assure you that I consider your claims on me as not at all diminished." It is true that amidst the general applause the voice of detraction made itself heard. The defenders of Londonderry were men of 2 nations and of 2 religions. During the siege, hatred of the Irishry had held together all Saxons, and hatred of Popery had held together all Protestants. But when the danger was over, the Englishman and the Scotchman, the Episcopalian and the Presbyterian, began to wrangle about the distribution of praises and rewards. The dissenting preachers, who had zealously assisted Walker in the hour of peril, complained that, in the account which he published of the siege, he had, though acknowledging that they had done good service, omitted to mention their names. The complaint was just, and had it been made in language becoming Christians and gentlemen, would probably have produced a considerable effect on the public mind. But Walker's accusers, in their resentment, disregarded truth and decency, used scurrilous language, brought calumnious accusations which were triumphantly refuted, and thus threw away the advantage which they had possessed. Walker defended himself with moderation and candour. His friends fought his battle with vigour, and retaliated keenly on his assailants. At Edinburgh perhaps the public opinion might have been against him, but in London the controversy seems only to have raised his character. He was regarded as an Anglican divine of eminent merit, who, after having heroically defended his religion against an army of Popish Rapparees, was rabbled by a mob of Scotch Covenanters. He presented to the Commons a petition setting forth the destitute condition to which the widows and orphans of some brave men who had fallen during the siege were now reduced. the Commons instantly passed a vote of thanks to him, and resolved to present to the King an address requesting that 10,000 pounds might be distributed among the families whose sufferings had been so touchingly described. The next day it was rumoured about the benches that Walker was in the lobby. He was called in. The Speaker, with great grace and dignity, informed him that the House had made haste to comply with his request, commended him in high terms for having taken on himself to govern and defend a city betrayed by its proper governors and defenders, and charged him to tell those who had fought under him that their fidelity and valour would always be held in grateful remembrance by the Commons of England. About the same time the course of parliamentary business was diversified by another curious and interesting episode, which, like the former, sprang out of the events of the Irish War. In the preceding spring, when every messenger from Ireland brought evil tidings, and when the authority of James was acknowledged in every part of that kingdom, except behind the ramparts of Londonderry and on the banks of Lough Erne, it was natural that Englishmen should remember with how terrible an energy the great Puritan warriors of the preceding generation had crushed the insurrection of the Celtic race. The names of Cromwell, of Ireton, and of the other chiefs of the conquering army, were in many mouths. One of those chiefs, Edmund Ludlow, was still living. At 22 he had served as a volunteer in the Parliamentary army. At 30 he had risen to the rank of lieutenant general. He was now old, but the vigour of his mind was unimpaired. His courage was of the truest temper, his understanding strong, but narrow. What he saw clearly, but he saw not much at a glance. In an age of perfidy and levity, he had, amidst manifold temptations and dangers, adhered firmly to the principles of his youth. His enemies could not deny that his life had been consistent, and that with the same spirit with which he had stood up against the Stuarts he had stood up against the Cromwells. There was but a single blemish on his fame, but that blemish, in the opinion of a great majority of his countrymen, was one for which no merit could compensate and which no time could efface. His name and seal were on the death warrant of Charles I. After the Restoration, Ludlow found a refuge on the shores of the Lake of Geneva. He was accompanied thither by another member of the High Court of Justice, John Liesel, the husband of that Alice Liesel whose death has left a lasting stain on the memory of James II. But even in Switzerland the regicides were not safe. A large price was set on their heads, and a succession of Irish adventurers, inflamed by national and religious animosity, attempted to earn the bribe. Liesel fell by one of the hands of these assassins, but Ludlow escaped unhurt from all the machinations of his enemies. A small knot of vehement and determined Whigs regarded him with a veneration which increased as years rolled away, and left him almost the only survivor, certainly the most illustrious survivor, of a mighty race of men, the conquerors in a terrible civil war, the judges of a king, the founders of a republic. More than once he had been invited by the enemies of the House of Stuart to leave his asylum, to become their captain, and to give the signal for a rebellion, but he had wisely refused to take any part in the desperate enterprises with which the Wildmans and Fergusons were never weary of planning. The Revolution opened a new prospect to him. The right of the people to resist oppression, a right which, during many years, no man could assert without exposing himself to ecclesiastical anathemas and to civil penalties, had been solemnly recognised by the Estates of the realm, and had been proclaimed by the Garter King-at-Arms on the very spot where the memorable scaffold had been set up 40 years before. James had not, indeed, like Charles, died the death of a traitor. Yet the punishment of the son might seem to differ from the punishment of the father rather in degree than in principle. Those who had recently waged war on a tyrant, who had turned him out of his palace, who had frightened him out of his country, who had deprived him of his crown, might perhaps think that the crime of going one step further had been sufficiently expiated by 30 years of banishment. Ludlow's admirers, some of whom appear to have been in high public stations, assured him that he might safely venture over, nay, that he might expect to be sent on high command to Ireland, where his name was still cherished by his old soldiers and by their children. He came, and early in September it was known that he was in London, but it soon appeared that he and his friends had misunderstood the temper of the English people. By all, except a small extreme section of the Whig party, the act, in which he had borne a part, never to be forgotten, was regarded not merely with the disapprobation due to a great violation of law and justice, but with horror such as even the Gunpowder Plot had not excited. The absurd and almost impious service which is still read in our churches on the 30th of January had produced in the minds of the vulgar a strange association of ideas. The sufferings of Charles were confounded with the sufferings of the Redeemer of mankind, and every regicide was a Judas, a Caiaphas, or a Herod. It was true that, when Ludlow sat on the tribunal in Westminster Hall, he was an ardent enthusiast of 28, and that now he had returned from exile a grey-headed and wrinkled man in his 70th year. Perhaps, therefore, if he had been content to live in close retirement, and to shun places of public resort, even zealous royalists might not have grudged the old republican a grave in his native soil. But he had no thought of hiding himself. It was soon rumoured that one of those murderers, who had brought on England's guilt, for which she annually, in sackcloth and ashes, implored God not to enter into judgment with her, was strutting about the streets of her capital, and boasting that he should ere long command her armies. His lodgings, it was said, were the headquarters of the most noted enemies of monarchy and episcopacy. The subject was brought before the House of Commons. The Tory members loudly called for justice on the traitor. None of the Whigs ventured to say a word in his defence. One or two faintly expressed a doubt whether the fact of his return had been proved by evidence such as would warrant a parliamentary proceeding. The objection was disregarded. It was resolved, without a division, that the King should be requested to issue a proclamation for the apprehending of Ludlow. Seymour presented the address, and the King promised to do what was asked. Some days, however, elapsed before the proclamation appeared. Ludlow had time to make his escape, and again hid himself in his Alpine retreat, never again to emerge. English travellers are still taken to see his house close to the lake, and his tomb in a church among the vineyards which overlook the little town of Vevey. On the house was formerly legible an inscription purporting that "To him to whom God is a father every land is a fatherland," and the epitaph on the tomb still attests to the feelings with which the stern old Puritan, to the last, regarded the people of Ireland and the House of Stuart. Tories and Whigs had concurred, or had affected to concur, in paying honour to Walker and in putting a brand on Ludlow. But the feud between the two parties was more bitter than ever. The King had entertained a hope that, during the recess, the animosities which had in the preceding session prevented an Act of Indemnity from passing would have been mitigated. On the day on which the Houses reassembled, he had pressed them earnestly to put an end to the fear and discord which could never cease to exist, while great numbers held their property and their liberty, and not a few even their lives, by an uncertain tenure. His exhortation proved of no effect. October, November, December passed away, and nothing was done. An indemnity bill, indeed, had been brought in and read once, but it had ever since lain neglected on the table of the House. Vindictive as had been the mood in which the Whigs had left Westminster, the mood in which they returned was more vindictive still. Smarting from old sufferings, drunk with recent prosperity, burning with implacable resentment, confident of irresistible strength, they were not less rash and headstrong than in the days of the Exclusion Bill. 1680 was come again. Again all compromise was rejected. Again the voices of the wisest and most upright friends of liberty were drowned by the clamour of hothead and designing agitators. Again moderation was despised as cowardice, or execrated as treachery. All the lessons taught by the cruel experience were forgotten. The very same men who had expiated, by years of humiliation, of imprisonment, of penury, of exile, the folly with which they had misused the advantage given them by the Popish plot, now misused with equal folly the advantage given them by the Revolution. The second madness would, in all probability, like the first, have ended in their proscription, dispersion, decimation, but for the magnanimity and wisdom of that great prince, who, bent on fulfilling his mission, and insensible alike to flattery and to outrage, coldly and inflexibly saved them in their own despite. It seemed that nothing but blood would satisfy them. The aspect and the temper of the House of Commons reminded men of the time of the ascendancy of Oates, and, that nothing might be wanting to the resemblance, Oates himself was there. As a witness, indeed, he could now render no service, but he had caught the scent of carnage, and came to gloat on the butchery in which he could no longer take an active part. His loathsome features were again daily seen, and his well-known "Ah, Lard! Ah, Lard!" was again daily heard in the lobbies and in the gallery. The House fell first on the renegades of the late reign. Of those renegades, the Earls of Peterborough and Salisbury were the highest in rank, but were also the lowest in intellect, for Salisbury had always been an idiot, and Peterborough had long been a dotard. It was, however, resolved by the Commons that both had, by joining the Church of Rome, committed high treason, and that both should be impeached. A message to that effect was sent to the Lords. Poor old Peterborough was instantly taken into custody, and was sent, tottering on a crutch, and wrapped up in woollen stuffs, to the Tower. The next day Salisbury was brought to the bar of his peers. He muttered something about his youth and his foreign education, and was then sent to bear Peterborough company. The Commons had meanwhile passed on to the offenders of humbler station and better understanding. Sir Edward Hales was brought before them. He had doubtless, by holding office in defiance of the Test Act, incurred heavy penalties. But these penalties fell far short of what the revengeful spirit of the victorious party demanded, and he was committed as a traitor. Then Obadiah Walker was let in. He behaved with a pusillanimity and disingenuousness which deprived him of all claim to respect or pity. He protested that he had never changed his religion, that his opinions had always been and still were those of some highly respectable divines of the Church of England, and that there were points on which he differed from the Papists. In spite of this quibbling, he was pronounced guilty of high treason, and sent to prison. Castlemaine was next put on the bar, interrogated, and committed under a warrant which charged him with the capital crime of trying to reconcile the kingdom to the Church of Rome. Section 2.